Thank you very much. And thank you so much for inviting me and for giving me a chance to talk about something that I don't know much about, to be completely honest. So I've sort of used the invitation to think about three artworks or four artworks was the original plan, that all stage or engage with plant-human relationships. And of course, then I realized that this morning we already had a paper about a very specific plant-human relationship, but my examples are not as radical, I'd say, as what we heard about this morning. But so these are all artworks that could be classified in a loose sense as conceptual art, and they all use living plants. And I am a theater and performance scholar, so I am interested or coming to this not as an art historian, but I'm interested in the performative aspects of these conceptual artworks. So basically, if we take a very famous definition of conceptual art by Sol Lewitt from the 1960s, he said that in conceptual art, the idea or concept is the most important aspect of the work. When an artist uses a conceptual form of art, it means that all of the planning and decisions are made beforehand, and the execution is a perfunctory affair. The idea becomes a machine that makes the art. And I think it's important for the artworks that I talk about today, and I think for much of what is nowadays classified loosely as conceptual art, that maybe what has changed from such a definition is that yes, the concept is really important, but it's not, there's not necessarily a primacy of the concept as opposed to the experience. So basically in the works that I talk about today, there is often a palpable tension between the concept, between what an artwork may be set out to achieve and the actual experience, or the concept is done in such a way that it cannot predict the experience in a way, and so that again, the performance itself becomes really important. And sort of the predecision to talk about conceptual art means, for me as a sort of theater and performance scholar, again, that I'm talking about a very specific type of plant performance. So I'm not taking, let's say, a wide performance studies approach as, for instance, Prudence Gibson does, where you talk about plant performance in a very wide sense. So plants perform already by orientating themselves towards the environment, by being smelly, showy, etc., attracting pollinators, and so on and so forth. And I'm also not talking about plant performance, let's say, in a botanical garden or other sort of framings, but I'm here really talking already about a conceptual frame, high art, as it were. And this also means that I'm not talking about more community-based or applied theater projects that you also have quite often, where people come together to do gardening, but it's framed as, let's say, a performance project rather than just quote-unquote gardening. So these are sort of my predecisions here, and it is related, I hope, to the topic of this conference, in the sense that all artworks that I'm talking about have a sort of weak narrative and are really working through affectivity, as I hope I can show. And I'm starting with something that was quite widely published in 2020. It received a lot of journalistic attention, and is an artwork by a Madrid-based artist called Eugenio Ampudia, Concert for the Bioscene. And this is what you see here, the Gran Teatro El Liceu in Barcelona, which is sort of the big grand opera house of the city. It has almost 3,000 seats. And in this piece of art or performance, these 3,000 seats are all occupied by plants. And it was the opening concert after the first COVID lockdown in Spain, which is also a reason why it received so much attention. And there are 4 human actors that you see on the stage, and they are playing a string quartet by Puccini called Chrysanthemi, which of course has a flower motif in its title, and is an elegiac string quartet, keeping with the use of chrysanthemums as a sort of morning flower. And so there are no other humans inside the building. The plants become the spectators, as it were. And this whole happening or performance was called a concert for the Biocene. It was also called a concert for plants. And I would say, actually that comes later on the slide, but I say it now. I'd say that there is a sort of tension here between 2 different forces. So a concert for the Biocene is a proposition for the future, that we should move out of the Anthropocene and come towards a different type of living together, which is called the Biocene. Whereas for the plants is an address to someone who is in the audience. But actually the performance, as I would argue, is not really for the plants. So there is no consideration here whether music is good for plants, whether there are any sort of side products of the performance that the plants as living beings might actually be interested in. But in the end, the sort of being a proposition for the future trumps the being for the plants, so that in the end it becomes again a concert for humans, is basically my argument for this piece. So Ampudia and his curator Blanca de la Torre understand the concert as a performance and what they call a symbolic proposal for a paradigm shift, as I said, from the Anthropocene to the Biocene. And they define the Biocene, which is quite typical, as a new era that finally places life in the center. And this is sort of where I take the title of my paper from, this idea of between bios and anthropos, because they are not using terms like the Blanthropocene, a term that Natasha Myers uses, or phytocentric thinking, which Michael Marder uses, so people from critical plant studies. So they are not talking about a concept of living together that is really focused on plants, right? So Natasha Myers calls the Blanthropocene an aspirational episteme of human-plant mutuality and respect within the current conditions of the Plantationocene or of the Anthropocene. So the idea that we can change something, but with a focus on plant life as being sort of the resource, not only the resource, but the living thing that we all need to live. So it's important that instead here it is about a wider idea of the bios, of which the anthropos is but one manifestation. It's still about this living together, but the plants are, let's say, less important. And so, as I said, even though it was advertised as a concert for plants, it was at the same time live streamed on the internet, and it's also recorded, so you can still watch the concert on the internet. And my sort of, again, as I said, argument here is that there is an unintentional and somewhat problematic anthropocentric framing in that performance. And that is that there is a human concept of mourning that is already implied through the choice of the music, which is written as a funeral elegy and which sort of refers to the use of chrysanthemums as flowers of mourning. There is an anthropomorphization. So you already sort of, it's less evident, I think, from the pictures here, but these plants are seated there as spectators. And if you watch the video, in the end, there's a sort of rustling of wind going through the leaves, and it's clearly there to mimic applause. So there is an anthropomorphization. There is an instrumentalization even of the plants, because afterwards they were given to health workers as a kind of companion plant. So all of these plants are used as house plants in Europe. So of course that is a good way of not wasting the plants that are used in the performance, but at the same time they're still bound to a human use. And then last but not least, the plants here become a symbol for a conceptual proposition. Okay, so they are here to tell us that we need to change our way of living. So they're bound up with this narrative, and this is really told to us rather than us being in the presence of these plants, let's say. So what's important here is there's not an artistic anticipation of a new order. So I think in Sharon's paper this morning, like regardless of what you think about the act of having sex with plants, it sort of anticipates a different world order, let's say. Whereas here, it remains a proposition, it remains a proposal. And I think there is a way to counteract this reading, to resist this anthropocentric reading, because there is this overwhelming presence of almost 3,000 plants, and we can imagine what it might be like to sort of be within their presence, but we are not allowed to be in their presence because there's a strict separation via mediation between the performance without human actors in a way and the plants that are there. So this is sort of the example that I started thinking with, and then I sort of tried to see what other examples do we have in conceptual art that use or talk about or engage with plant-human relationships, and how might they relate to this question of being between an inclusive concept of life and a more anthropocentric conception of life. And so my next example is by an American artist called Von Bell, who does a lot of different plant-based works, but I'm focusing here on her so-called personal biospheres, which she has done many times for different exhibitions. And basically, what you have there is that these biospheres are really small scale, so that a human can be in the presence of the plants, right? So they can stick their head in, but they can never fully immerse. So in contrast to, let's say, Biosphere 2, that you will know as a sort of scientific project of replacing nature with a sort of new nature, there is no illusion here that we could live in these little houses, let's say. Okay, so these small biospheres are determined by the local conditions of each installation. So for every exhibition, Von Bell will work together with local communities and will sort of try to install plant life that is local to the exhibition. They are not scaled for the human participant who is invited in, but is never fully immersed. So there is a clear, let's say, decentering of the hierarchy where human might be at the center, because these are scaled on a sort of, on a plant basis, let's say. But of course, at the same time, there are these human metaphors, these human narratives, still abounding, like the idea of nature as a home or oikos. That is very clear in how these terrariums or biospheres are designed. The focus, as not only the artist writes, but also a lot of the participants or when this work is being discussed, is the focus is on breathing, smelling, and seeing. So we only have the head inside the terrarium. We cannot touch. But it's about making people aware of their mutual dependence with the environment and with each other as they share the air. And this can be related to a concept that is quite prominent in plant studies, which is the idea of plant blindness. So the idea that despite the importance that plants have for our world, for our living, etc., we do not actually see them, quote unquote, in daily life. So in a way, to frame them, to cut them out in a way of a larger environment and put them into these little houses makes us aware of the plants being there, and then hopefully of their importance. So we could say that the artistic framing here brings spectators into the presence of plants, and this is different from not seeing them or seeing them in a more quotidian, I have to hurry up, in a more quotidian encounter as a way to move beyond plant blindness. And this is informed by Glenn Albrecht's notion of the symbiocene, which affirms the interconnectedness of life and all living things. So that is sort of, again, a concept that the artist works with. And so I come to my last example, which is by a very famous French artist called Pierre Huyghe. And he comes from a somewhat different tradition, as I hope will become clear. And I'm talking about two artworks very quickly. The first one is called Nymphaea Transplant 14 to 18, and it is a transposition, as it were, of Monet's water lilies. So basically, it takes the soil from Giverny, which is the house of Monet, or the village, where Monet has his artificial water lily ponds. And there are water lilies in there, there are fish in there. It's a living ecosystem. And the lighting and the glass, which is switchable, so it dims and it becomes transparent, mimic weather patterns at Giverny from 1914 to 1918 in a rapid succession. So what happens here is that it is a three-dimensional living ecosystem. We cannot enter it. So in this sense, we are separate from it, as in the first example, but it withdraws from the scopic regime of Impressionism, which means Monet has an artificial pond made so that he can produce water lilies, so that he can produce paintings, so that we can consume these paintings. Whereas here, as you sort of see, we almost see the undergrowth of that, and it's not there for us as spectators. So depending on when you come to this, it can be more clear and you see something, or it can be more obscure and you don't see anything. And there is less of a relationship to a concept than in the first two artworks that I talked about. So it was used in an Anthropocene exhibition called Reset Modernity at the Center for Media Art in Karlsruhe in Germany, which was curated by Bruno Latour. And Latour says about the work, what does this work of art say about ecology and Impressionism? It does not say anything. And that is sort of quite important here, that it evolves around this, but it does not have a clear message. And that is precisely Huyghe's method, which is about delinking, denarrating, descripting, so that there is no narrative authority that makes a relation between things. So plants here become sort of part of an artistic practice that creates conditions for something to happen rather than a prescribed narrative, okay? And so the other example is just basically to show this, it was at the Documenta 13 in 2012, basically in a public park in Kassel. There was this sculpture which has an active beehive as a head. There is this dog which was called Human that roamed the site, and the site itself was a compost site with a lot of different plants, including poisonous plants, etc. And if you didn't know in a way that there was an artwork, you could also just walk by and not, like if you see this here, not recognize it as an artwork. So what this is really about is a destruction in a way of narrative. And this is my last slide, and I have 1 minute left. And so to conclude, All three artists work through practices that transplant plants. So there is a sort of kind of framing in there, which is important in order to make the plants more present, though in weak they can actually be substituted by other non-human living beings. All three establish affective relationships between plants and humans as companion plants in Amphilia, which I said is the most problematic in my view, as symbiotic environments in Bell, and then in weak as a sort of withdrawal from narrative that maybe allows us to live together in an unforeseen manner. I think you had this quote from Masumi this morning with the affective environment, which is quite useful here. And if I had the time, I would say that comparing these approaches can also show us like different modes of what art can do. And it relates to, I think, the discussion that we had this morning about didactic art. So the first one is really didactic. It is the illustration of a proposal. The second one is didactic to a certain extent, but it is really about manifesting something and anticipating a different order by putting us in the presence of the plants. And the last one is the least didactic, which sort of also makes it more difficult to then think about what it means, but it is precisely about this unplanned encounter. And then I had another artist that I don't do for reasons of time, but there's an image. Okay, thank you very much.